Uh, you just heard her say it. Welcome back to the show. For everyone else coming up, just know that if you're in the audience, it's only recording the person that's on screen at a time. So I'm going to keep the show rolling right along. Okay, this next person, look, kids these days, they learn geography, they learn the states and the capitals, but this next person could probably tell you the senators, the House of Representatives for not only the capital, as in the Congress, but the state senators of every state. I mean, this person has been a political junkie since they were 15 years old. She knew all 535 members of Congress and where each one was from. Everyone, please help give it up in the comments for our next performer. I am so excited to welcome Rebecca to the stage.
Ah, thank you, thank you, thank you. Um, well, I'm going to tell you about the day I discovered what it was like to have power in the adult world. At the age of 15 in 1968, I was a teenage political junkie. I had become very much aware of the dangerous, scary world I was growing up in with riots and assassinations. And it seemed like understanding politics was a way to achieve some kind of control. So I was a little factoid machine. I could tell you about every member of Congress and all the political strategies going on in that year, which, as you remember, was a big presidential election year. Remember, Nixon and Humphrey were the two big candidates, and George Wallace was the independent candidate. Now, George Wallace was a racist and an old fashioned racist. And in my household, he was the definition of evil. Back before it was fashionable, my father, who was a Republican, told me that if he ever won anything, we were going to leave the country. Now, people say that kind of thing every political year now, but back then nobody ever said that. So that got my attention, and he was very, very serious about it. So um, I was in high school. I was a sophomore in high school, and we had a little meet the press type program where students would interview prominent people locally, and it would be aired on the little UHF channels on television on the weekend. And so when I had the opportunity, I quickly signed up to be the journalist on this Meet the Press type show. And the person we interviewed was the chairman of the 1968 George Wallace campaign in our state, which at that time was North Carolina. And for me, this interview was a very big deal. All right, this is going up against the bad guys. And so I'm going to take just a little bit of background here. You'll remember that George Wallace was trying to take the election away from Humphrey. It was sort of a stooge for Nixon. So if you voted for Wallace, it was going to take electoral votes away, he hoped, take electoral votes away from Hubert Humphrey and give the election to Nixon, which is in fact exactly what ended up happening. And so, but the Wallace people didn't like to admit that. So when he came on, I said in my sweet little 15-year-old voice, so if you weren't supporting Wallace, who would you be supporting? And he says, well, we're supporting George Wallace. And I said, I totally understand that. And if you weren't supporting Wallace, who would you be supporting? And he says, well, really, we support George Wallace. And I said, I completely get that. And if you weren't supporting Wallace, who would you be supporting? And I ended up asking him five times, five times. And I think he felt like he was going to, if he didn't answer the question, he was going to be beating up on this 15-year-old kid, and he didn't want to look like a bad guy. So he finally said, well, I guess we would support Nixon. Well, the show aired on Sunday. And the next morning, on Monday morning, I picked up my local newspaper, and it said this guy had been fired for having said that on our television show, for admitting it to me. And I felt like I had slain the dragon, like I was the coolest thing in the world. And and it was it was a way I learned what it meant to hold adults accountable, for their actions, and that even as a kid I was capable of doing that. To this day, that remains one of the best days of my life.
Rebecca, oh my gosh, give it up for Rebecca.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. Okay, that is called holding people to account. Yeah. I wish more hard-hitting reporters were doing that these days. Thank you for asking the tough questions, Rebecca. This person that's coming up next has told me some of the most illustrious stories One of the first ones was about being on a cruise liner to Norway in the 60s. I was like, this person has lived one of the most interesting lives I've ever heard. One of their fun facts correlates to the stories that they've told in this class, which is that they once got locked while working in prison inside a men's bathroom. She is Carolyn, everyone. Carolyn, give it up for Carolyn.
Well, first, I just want to say this has been a really fun class, and I have enjoyed it. And I want to thank our teacher. I only wish he weren't in Brooklyn, because I would like to have him over for a cup of tea, or his preference, alcohol. That would be good too. My story. My dad died in 1981. He was in his early 70s, and his health hadn't been great. He was a man of many addictive qualities. He tended to be addicted to nicotine. Once in a while, he'd give up cigarettes, but then he'd take up the pipe. I don't think he ever smoked cigars, but he might have. He also liked to drink. Never missed a glass of scotch at night, probably 2 or 3 sometimes. But he lived life to the fullest. I'm not sure he would have had it any other way. However, when I got this phone call in snowy New England on February 5th, he was in snowy Colorado, where my parents lived. And my sister called and said, Dad died this afternoon. My heart dropped to my toes. This was a very sad, sad time of my life. I was happy to think that I had talked to him 2 days before, because it had been my birthday. My dad didn't like to talk on the phone very much, but on one of his daughter's birthdays, he came through and we had a nice conversation. I should have been suspicious that maybe something was quite wrong, because he told me the day before he had been cross-country skiing on the trail below the ranch. And he must have fainted, because the first thing when he regained consciousness was his great big German Shepherd licking his face, licking the blood that the fall probably hit some twigs, but was covering his face. But he made it kind of into a joke. He said he got back to his feet, he got home. But obviously this was a warning sign. He had probably had many other warning signs. At any rate, I've always treasured the fact that I got to talk to him so close to the time I could never talk to him again. It turned out that on the day he died, he was working at his office with his secretary, and his secretary said, you know, Henry, it's my 50th birthday today. And he said, oh, a good excuse for a martini lunch. So off they went to a restaurant close by. They walked over, and I think halfway there, he had one of his angina attacks, which had gone on for years. And his secretary ran back to the office and got him his nitroglycerin or whatever he was taking. He popped his pills and he revived. This had happened before. And off they went for their martini lunch. As he was toasting her, apparently, he had a massive heart attack, slumped to the floor. They called an ambulance. And before much more happened, he died on the way to the hospital. He went probably the way he would have wanted to go, with his secretary, drinking a martini and having skied the day before. My dad not only loved cigarettes and liquor, he also loved anything like apple pie. And when I say like apple pie, apple dumplings, apple crisp, apple crepes, Suzette, whatever. So whenever I was with him, I've always loved to cook. I've always loved to care for people through cooking. And I always loved to make my dad happy. So I made an awful lot of apple desserts when he would come and visit us in New England, or I would be out in Colorado with him. At any rate, I flew out to the service, and so many people had so many wonderful things to say about this man who had had a very interesting life. And I found that I wept more over the reports of what they felt about him than I did about my own grief of having lost him. I've never quite understood that, but that's how it was. So I think about him often. I'm so glad he was my dad. I'm glad he loved me. He loved my husband. He loved his grandchildren. I only wish he had lived long enough to see his grandchildren having their children and getting married and being grown-ups, because they were all quite young when he died. I will always miss my dad. Thank you.
So much. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Wow. This has been a class of everything from the deeply vulnerable, like Carolyn just shared, to the worst first dates that Leo has ever had. And we celebrated all, and we are so grateful that you shared that with us. So thank you. I'm going to keep it coming, and our next performer almost has a similar name to the current one. This is a person who has also had an illustrious life, worldwide travels, but the strangest thing about her might be that she has not had a television set since she moved out to go to college, which is truly a feat. Everyone, give it up for Carol.
So, when I was young, my mother used to tell my sisters and I that if anything happened to one of us, she just couldn't bear it. We would roll our eyes and say, "Oh, come on." I had no idea what she was talking about. To me, life was an adventure and I was invincible. I loved roller coasters, horror movies, downhill skiing, all sorts of sports. I just embraced life. As I got older, I learned also to explore life in the world through learning languages and travel. In fact, I quit my first job in accounting in order to go study French. And soon after, I met a charming man from Germany. And before long, that's where I was living. I never looked back. I just looked forward to these new lands, new adventures. And I think I could have continued on this way forever. But something came along that changed the course of my life. My son Lucas was born. He was such a cute baby. When he was first born, he had tiny little hands and he had a bald head, a big cry. Our first few days together were just magical. It was a new kind of adventure, exploring this new and deep love. The day came for my husband and I to take Lucas home, and the air was filled with new beginnings, all sorts of excitement. But as we approached our apartment, I suddenly was overcome with this feeling of dread that made me cry. I realized that this tiny little boy was extremely vulnerable, and I was responsible for keeping him alive. It was a lot to take in. And my deep love for him and then this new realization, it just cracked that armor of invincibility. And for the first time, I really experienced this extreme feeling of vulnerability. Now, in the days and weeks and months that followed, I learned a lot of new skills, and I learned to recognize all his cries. And I became a competent mother, which was good. We had a really wonderful family life. But every now and then over the next years, there was always something that would happen that would just remind me of this vulnerability. One day, for example, we went out with some friends who have a daughter, and they had a son who was 2 days older than our son. We went to the Palm and Garden in Frankfurt. It's a park, and it has botanical gardens, and it has some nice playgrounds. And it's surrounded by a fence, and there's no cars inside, so it's really ideal for going with children. We walked along the pathways, and we went by the waterfall, and then we crossed over a charming bridge that spanned this pond. And we stood there, and we were debating about what to do next, which direction to go in. And I looked around, and all of a sudden I noticed Lucas wasn't there. I said, Armin, where is Lucas? And my husband looked at me and said, I don't know. And I asked the others, and nobody knew where he was. So we all started calling, Lucas, Lucas, and looking around. And I knew he couldn't be far because he really was not the type to wander at all. But we kept on calling, Lucas, and he wasn't around. So I started walking, backtracking a bit over to the bridge, and I looked out at the water. And I remembered reading more than once that when small children fall into water, they don't really struggle, they just sink, and they often drown. Could he be in the water? I really don't think I could miss that, but I didn't know where he was. I said, Armin, we've got to check out this water. So we walked, looked carefully over the bridge and peered into the water, but it was dark and murky, and we really couldn't see anything at all. I knew that if he was in the water, we only had like 2 or 3 minutes, and then he would be gone. I said, Armin, you've got to go in the water. You've got the better eyes. You've got to go and you've got to look for him. And so he started taking off his shoes, and I was looking around, and I was just like, this is crazy. I mean, maybe we're crazy, you know, this can't be true. But I know that nobody thinks their child is going to drown. And then Armin was taking off his shoes. And I thought, you know, this wasn't the adventure I was looking for today at all. And he started walking towards the water. And then suddenly our friend Thomas said, I found him. And there was Lucas. He had his little smile, and he was trundling towards us. Oh, it was just such a relief. I couldn't live without him. And I guess I knew what my mother meant those years ago. Now Lucas is 20 years old, and he's a lot sturdier. But I think any parent knows that real worry of vulnerability, that never goes away totally. So I'm a changed person in that way. And yet at the same time, I still have a sense of adventure. It's not the same anymore. I sometimes reminisce about those carefree days, and I don't have that same carefree attitude. But on the other hand, now my heart and my eyes are open, and there's other kinds of adventures. Who knows what will come?
Wow, Carol. Oh my gosh. This is the second time I've done this class with you. Carol is the reason this entire thing happened. And it has been a pleasure watching you share stories and painting life with a complex, nuanced, delicate, and loving brush. So thank you. Carol. Okay, this next person, I'm just going to keep it rolling, doesn't know her right from her left, except politically. Whoa, with the zingers. Prisl coming in hot. Okay, everyone give it up for Prisl.
Thanks, Philip. And Philip, I second Carolyn in thanking you for this class. It's been fun. It's been nerve-wracking. It's been a really great time. In May 1998, I was a wife, a mother of 2 children. Philip was 8 and Rachel 5, and I was a daughter. My dad was sick with COPD. In fact, he was dying a slow death. On May 8th, it was a Friday. It seemed like an ordinary day. That morning, I went to Rachel's kindergarten rainforest play. In the afternoon, my mom called and said my dad had taken a turn for the worst, and he was in the hospital in a coma and probably wouldn't last the weekend. I called my husband, Phil, and told him the news, and he said he'd be right home to drive me the 2 hours to Plymouth, New Hampshire. And I told him, no, honey, your job this weekend is to take care of the two kids. And it's my job to do this journey on my own. I made it up to Plymouth, New Hampshire that evening, and all 5 of the siblings got there. And in the evening time, my mom got tired and she asked to be brought home to rest. But that evening, the 5 of us sat around in my dad's hospital bed and told stories. One time we were trying to think of all his brothers and sisters. And even though he was in a coma, he started being restless. He was trying to tell us that we had them in the wrong order. The next day on Saturday was a day of sitting and waiting and people coming to say goodbye to my dad. In-laws, siblings. Toward the late afternoon, my mother, my sister Louise, and we went to my mom's and we made a ham sandwich, a simple ham sandwich. It was probably the most delicious sandwich I've ever eaten. We returned to the hospital, and a little while later, I almost fainted. The nurse came up to me and said, "We've been watching you this weekend, and all weekend, you've been taking care of everyone else. Your dad is dying. Here's some tissues." And at that very moment, my dad smiled. I firmly believe he knew I would be the one that would have a hard time to let go of him. All the right words had been said, but it hadn't touched my heart until that moment. I remember we were saying, "Dad, it's okay to let go. Dad, we'll take care of Mom." At that very moment, I realized I never hear my dad ever say again, "Just okay." When we talked on the phone and he'd ask me how I was, if I said okay, he'd say, "Just okay." Just okay wasn't good enough for my dad. I thought I'd never smell his Old Spice aftershave. I never feel his 5 o'clock shadow on my cheek. I cried, I took a nap. When I woke up, my dad was in the throes of actively dying. It was like a stage had been set. The little TV in the hospital room was on the Red Sox game. Happy to report they won 3-1. About midnight, his breathing started to change. And I was the only one in the room that noticed it. My daughter Rachel had asthma since she was a baby, and I had to learn how her breathing changed by the sound and the looks to give her medicine. So I was the only one that saw it. I went to the nurse's station and they said, "Yes, this is the end." When my dad took his last breath everyone was where they wanted to be. My mom, my sister Louise, and I were by his side. My sisters Linda and Nancy weren't there. They had gone back to their hotel room, but they didn't want to be there. My brother Billy didn't know where he wanted to be. And he had just stepped into the bathroom. And when he came out, it was all over. My dad died on May 10th, 1998. It was Mother's Day. Mother's Day has never been the same. A little while later, I met up with Perry, a friend, a teacher, a preschool teacher for Rachel. I hadn't seen her in about a year. We met at the Carlisle post office and we started to talk. And she asked me how I was doing. And I said, just okay. Well, like I said, I hadn't seen her in a year. And she said, well, I had a baby last month. And I really didn't have to ask this question, but I did. I said, boy or girl? And she said, boy. So we went over to her car and looked at the little baby. And I said, what's his name? And she said, William. That was my dad's name.
Oh my gosh, Prisl. I mean, there was so many, it's a masterclass in storytelling just there. Specifically, the line that stuck out to me as someone that has gone through this. And one thing we've learned in this class is that the personal can become universal, and you never know who's been through something like you've been through, but all the right words had been said. Like I went through that myself, and having to feel it in my heart was the real challenge. And thank you for giving me a taste of that now. Very touching. I'm so glad you took this class. I'm so glad everyone did. As Carol just said in the comments, this has been a pleasure for me. Look, I teach people, we're coming to our final storyteller, so I'll just say this all now. We teach these workshops across the world. I teach with a lot of different age groups, but there's nothing quite like the stories that I've heard in this class. It has been a teachable moment for me to get to witness your lives and to be honored that you would listen to anything I have to say about how you want to share that. So thank you very much. It has been my pleasure. And now let's bring on our final storyteller. You could find her on the trail talking to salamanders, because that's her thing. Please help everyone give it up. Let me find her. Oh, and she looks very dapper in this chair. For Nancy.
Thank you. Well, I am very fortunate. I have had the great pleasure of raising two beautiful children, Carolyn and David. You know, there's nothing like the warmth and fulfillment of cradling a newborn in your arms, looking into their eyes, your warmth mingling with their warmth. I remember the joyous feeling of snuggling up with them and reading books. One of the first books we read, of course, was Pat the Bunny. And I remember taking their tiny little hand and moving it to the page with the fur so that they too could pat the bunny. I remember the calm, infused evenings where we read Goodnight Moon, Goodnight Brush, Goodnight Mush, Good night to the old lady whispering hush. I remember with delight when our roles were reversed and they were reading to me about the antics of Fluffy the porcupine, who was trying to find his identity. There came a time when Fluffy began to doubt that he was Fluffy. And when they were independent readers, I remember so much fun when we would gather on the couch and read Harry Potter aloud as a family. I can remember my husband's Dobby voice. Dobby hears things, sir. Dobby's a house elf. He goes all over the castle, lighting fires and mopping floors. all too soon, Carolyn and David were grown up and they were off to college. And I was empty nested. Gone were those warm times reading together. And gone was my active life. Gone was the ballet recitals, the piano recitals, the band concerts, the 7th grade play, the high school musicals, soccer games, track meets, cross-country meets, cross-country skiing meets. They were all gone too. I was empty nested. Empty. That's how I felt. As I was floundering around looking for something to fill the void, my husband suggested perhaps I would like nature photography. I was skeptical at first that nature photography would be a good fit, because in nature photography you have to stop and take a picture. And I was already the slowest hiker in our family. But Steve's intuition was right. I did like nature photography. But I also realized it was better to do nature photography solo. On nature photography mornings, I would get up early, drive over to one of Carlisle's conservation lands, and walk slowly down the trail looking. On one day, it was a bright sunny day, at the cranberry bog, I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It's a male ebony jewel-winged dragonfly. And at a delicate 1 3/4 inches, it is a jewel. Its long, needle-like, slender body is metallic, iridescent, emerald green. And its wings, folded over its body, are lacy and a deep ebony. And in the sunshine, the body glimmers between the emerald green and a cerulean blue, as if to say, I am here. In those moments that I'm looking, really looking, I'm not in the past, mulling over that stupid thing I said at breakfast. I'm not in the future, wondering, oh, do I have everything that I need for my meeting? I'm in the present, fully present. And in that moment, the emptiness is filled with peace.
Can't wait to take it home, Nancy. Wow, you guys, everyone. Okay, I want everyone in the audience and performers, turn on your mics and let's just all give a round of applause and some cheers for all of our performers today. It's not easy, y'all. Beautiful. Storytelling hour in Carlisle every week. I'm ready.
That was great.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing, everyone. As I mentioned, this is the Brooklyn Comedy Collective. We do storytelling, comedy, stand-up, improv, you name it. I just put our little website in the chat if you ever want to check us out. We do these private classes all over. Thank you again to Carlisle Council on Aging for bringing us out. And wow, I have been blessed to work with you. I'm going to miss our group, and I hope I get to see you all fairly soon in some way, one way or the other. Yay!
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Philip,
Yeah.
totally awesome, Philip. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, all right, I'm signing off, everybody. The Zoom is closing. We're going out of our boxes and into the real world. And as Nancy said, let's do our best to stay present.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. We'll be in
Bye.
touch.